You nodded. You said you would. You meant it. And then, nothing changed. Not because you forgot. Not because you didn't care. You thought about it. More than once. You even felt a little guilty about not doing it. But somehow, days turned into weeks, and the advice your doctor gave you is still sitting somewhere in the back of your mind, untouched. Here's the uncomfortable part. This doesn't happen to people who are checked out. It happens most reliably to people who are thoughtful, who read, who understand consequences, who by every measure should know better. So what is actually going on? There's a quiet assumption most people carry into a doctor's office, that if something is serious enough, if the information is clear enough, the behavior will follow automatically. That knowledge is the missing ingredient, that once you understand the stakes, the rest takes care of itself. Behavioral science has been quietly dismantling that assumption for decades. More information does not reliably produce better behavior. In certain conditions, it actually makes things worse. And the smarter, more self-aware the person, the more sophisticated the resistance tends to be. Researchers call it the intention-behavior gap, the space between fully intending to do something and actually doing it. And in medicine, that gap is not a small rounding error. Studies on patients managing heart disease, type 2 diabetes, hypertension, conditions where following advice is, without exaggeration, a matter of survival, still show non-adherence rates hovering around 40 to 50%. Not in people who were confused, not in people who dismissed their doctor, in people who understood, who agreed, who said the right things in the room and genuinely meant them. That number doesn't suggest carelessness. It suggests something deeper is happening, something that operates below the level of conscious decision-making. There are 3 psychological mechanisms doing most of the work here, and once you see them clearly, you'll start recognizing them everywhere. The first is called optimism bias. It's one of the most well-documented findings in cognitive psychology. Humans, across cultures, across age groups, across education levels, consistently and systematically underestimate their own personal risk compared to other people. Not dramatically, not obviously, just enough to matter. Neuroscientist Tali Sharot spent years mapping this. When people are told about negative outcomes, illness, accidents, financial loss, they update their beliefs about what could happen to others, but they barely update their beliefs about what could happen to themselves. The brain is not processing the warning as personal information. It's filing it somewhere adjacent to personal. This isn't arrogance. The optimism bias is actually a feature of human cognition. It keeps people motivated. It keeps people moving forward when rational analysis might suggest giving up. But in a medical context, it quietly transforms direct warnings into something that feels like a statistic about other people. When your doctor says your blood pressure is at a dangerous level, some part of your brain is genuinely hearing a description of what happens to people like you, not a prediction about you specifically. The threat is real and acknowledged and simultaneously not quite personal. Both things are true at once, and the gap between them is exactly where the advice gets lost. But here's what most people never notice. Optimism bias doesn't disappear when people are informed about it. Knowing it exists doesn't make you immune. If anything, smarter people tend to construct more elaborate reasons why, in their particular case, the concern is probably overstated. The second mechanism is cognitive dissonance. Leon Festinger introduced this concept in the 1950s, and it has held up extraordinarily well. The core idea is simple. When 2 pieces of information conflict inside the mind, especially when one of them threatens your sense of who you are, the brain experiences genuine psychological discomfort, real dissonance, and it is strongly motivated to resolve that discomfort. The logical resolution would be to change the behavior, But that's rarely the path the brain chooses, because changing the behavior also means accepting the threat as real and personal, which is itself uncomfortable. So instead, the brain does something quieter. It reframes the information. Think about what happens in that doctor's office for someone who genuinely thinks of themselves as a capable, put-together person. Someone who exercises occasionally, eats reasonably well, holds their life together under real pressure. That self-image is not vanity. It's load-bearing. It's part of how they function. And then a doctor implies with numbers and neutral clinical language that the body is not cooperating with that self-image. The brain has options. It can accept the information fully and feel the threat that comes with it. Or it can subtly, almost automatically, begin to find reasons why the information might be incomplete. The test might have been off. The guidelines might be overly conservative. There was actually an article about that recently. This particular doctor might be cautious by temperament. The last doctor wasn't concerned. None of this feels like denial. It feels like reasonable critical thinking. It feels like being an informed patient who doesn't just accept everything uncritically. The resistance is intellectually dressed. And that's what makes it so effective and so invisible. This isn't weakness in the person. It's the brain doing exactly what it's built to do. Protect the coherence of the self. But the cost is that genuinely important information gets quietly neutralized before it ever reaches behavior. The third mechanism is present bias, and in some ways it's the most fundamental. Behavioral economists use the term hyperbolic discounting to describe a predictable quirk in how humans value time. The further a reward is in the future, the less weight the brain assigns to it. Not proportionally, but sharply, disproportionately. The present carries enormous psychological weight. The future carries surprisingly little. This is not immaturity. It is not a character flaw. It is the default operating mode of every human brain, shaped over hundreds of thousands of years of evolution in environments where the future was genuinely uncertain and the present was urgent. The problem is that most medical advice is structured entirely around future outcomes. Lower your cholesterol now. Change your eating habits now. Move more now. And the promised benefit, reduced risk of a serious event in 10 or 15 or 20 years, is so distant that it barely registers as a real cost-benefit calculation. There's a way to understand this that's actually a little unsettling. Psychological research on how people relate to their future selves shows that in brain imaging studies, thinking about your future self activates similar neural patterns to thinking about a stranger. Not a close friend, not a family member, a stranger. So when the brain is weighing present discomfort against future benefit, it's not quite experienced as a trade-off you're making for yourself. It's experienced as a sacrifice you're being asked to make for someone you don't entirely know yet. No wonder the math doesn't work out the way it should. What makes this particularly interesting is how these three mechanisms reinforce each other. The optimism bias keeps the threat feeling impersonal. Cognitive dissonance keeps the information from landing as real. And present bias ensures that even when something does register, the future consequence doesn't carry enough weight to move behavior in the present. They're not three separate problems. They're one interconnected system, and they tend to be strongest in exactly the moments when the stakes are highest. It doesn't look dramatic. There's no single moment of refusal. There's no conscious decision to ignore the advice. It's quieter than that. It's a series of small, completely reasonable feeling delays in reframes and competing priorities until enough time has passed that the advice has just somehow faded into background noise. Slowly, something shifts when people actually understand these mechanisms, not just intellectually, but in a way that makes the pattern recognizable in real time. Because the gap here was never about information. The person already had the information. The gap was between information and the self, between what was known and what felt personally real, between a future outcome and a present moment that always seemed to need something more immediate. This is why behavioral approaches to health focus less on education and more on structure. Not better explanations of risk, but implementation intentions. Not general commitments, but specific, concrete, situational plans that make the abstract decision into a concrete habit. Not appeals to future outcomes, but connections to present identity and immediate meaning. The brain doesn't change because it was told something important. It changes when the important thing becomes concrete enough, personal enough, and present enough to actually exist in the space where decisions get made. There's something almost quietly clarifying about this. The person sitting in that doctor's office, nodding and meaning it, and then somehow never quite following through. They weren't failing to take it seriously. They were taking it seriously in exactly the way their brain knew how to, through the filters of a mind that naturally protects its optimism, guards its self-image, and lives most powerfully in the present tense. The advice didn't fail to land because something was wrong with the person. It failed to land because advice alone has never been enough, for anyone. And once you understand that, the question changes entirely. It stops being, why can't I just do what I know I should? And it becomes something much more useful. What would it actually take for this to feel real to me?